Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for Policy and Practice, How to Build Long-Term Financial Wellness. My name is Catherine Harvey, and I'm a Senior Policy Advisor at the AARP Public Policy Institute. On behalf of AARP and the Social Policy Institute at Washington University in St. Louis, I'd like to welcome you to today's important conversation. We will be talking about the evidence for what moves the needle on financial well-being. What do we know? Where are the gaps and what questions remain? For those of you who are new to the field of study of financial well-being, today's conversation is really at an important turning point for this nascent body of research. It's taken about a decade or so for researchers and academics and practitioners to coalesce around a common definition of financial well-being and an understanding of how to measure it. And today, now that we have several years of data under our belts, we get to move on to the exciting question of how do we move the needle on financial well-being? How can we help people improve their overall financial well-being? Leaders in this field come from across many sectors, including inside government at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, think tanks and researchers who you'll hear from today, as well as practitioners, community-based organizations, and others. I just would like to have you know that you can follow today's conversation online and add your questions and comments about anything you hear. This conversation is being recorded. I'd like to say a special thanks to two of the presenters today, Emily Gallagher and Jeremy Burke. AARP is proud to support their work, in particular, looking at the question of the relationship between short-term financial security and in particular, liquid savings and long-term financial well-being. Of interest to AARP, of course, is what antecedents, what predictors of financial well-being can move the needle on financial well-being later in life, so that longer term people have the ability to age with dignity and financial security. We hope this conversation will be interesting to a vast array of stakeholders. In particular, we're looking to researchers to take advantage of the findings that you hear today and to identify some gaps in literature. Where can you add new knowledge? And what research questions do you have that you might be able to pursue to contribute to this body of work? For practitioners, perhaps you're in the field of employee financial well-being, or you're an employer, or a community-based financial coaching group. What insights can you derive from these magnificent speakers and the evidence that they have to apply to your own product and program design? And then, of course, to policymakers. Where can we invest wisely to ensure that people can improve their financial well-being over time, are upwardly mobile, and in particular, protect against those financial shocks that all of us experience, but that especially hurt people who have the least financial resources to bounce back. Today's conversation is going to consist of a panel of researchers, followed by a moderated discussion. I would encourage you, as you're listening to submit your questions through the Q&A function, not through the chat. So that's a little bit different. I want to repeat that. That's the Q&A function in Zoom today, which you can find in your control panel. And our Social Policy Institute colleagues will be moderating that chat and serving the questions to our moderator, to Hector Ortiz from the CFPB. And he will be able to bring up some common themes and some common questions from you. So before I begin, I just want to repeat that use the Q&A function and not the chat, and that we will hold all questions until the discussion portion following the three researchers that you will hear from today. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce our first panelist of the day, Jeremy Burke. Jeremy is a research scientist at the Dornsife Center for Economic and Social Research at the University of Southern California. Jeremy?
Great, thanks, Catherine. Pull up my slides. Great, thanks so much. And thanks to AARP and SPI for putting on this event. In this project, we're going to examine what factors and behaviors might put one on the path to increasing future financial well-being. And I want to acknowledge and thank AARP for providing funding, financial support from this research. So our main outcome variable of interest here is going to be one's subjective assessment of how well they're doing financially, their financial well-being. And increasingly, researchers and practitioners alike are recognizing that it's important to study these subjective measures in addition to objective measures like savings balances and debt levels. And these subjective measures may be a closer indication of happiness or utility, which is what economists are often after. So as Catherine alluded to, there's been a fair bit of recent research working to define and measure financial well-being and examine some of its differentious determinants. But there's been relatively less research that has looked at how financial well-being evolves over time. I'll talk a bit about that, and I think Stephen will pick up that thread in his presentation next. There's also been relatively little research looking at what factors of behaviors are predictive of substantial increases in financial well-being. That is, what seems to put one on the path to improve financial well-being in the future. And that's what we're going to look at in this paper that I'm going to talk about. In particular, we're going to use 4 years worth of longitudinal data that we collected pre-pandemic to examine how financial well-being evolves over time in the aggregate, and also to hone in on what behaviors and factors and characteristics appear to be associated with large increases and large decreases in financial well-being. Much in our world changed early in 2020, so we're going to take a look and see whether or not the relationships we find pre-pandemic also appear to hold post-pandemic. And then the paper does a few other things as well, including looking at the relationship between stimulus receipt and change in the financial well-being that I will not have time to talk about here, but encourage you to take a look at the paper if you're interested in topics like that. So our primary outcome measure is going to be the CFPB's financial well-being scale, which measures financial well-being on a 0 to 100 point scale. It's designed to comprehensively measure how one feels about their financial situation subjectively. So it captures whether or not someone feels in control of day-to-day finances, feels like they have capacity to absorb a financial shock, they feel like they're on track to meet their financial goals, or whether or not they have the financial freedom to enjoy life. So for our purposes, we're going to define a large change to be an increase or decrease in financial well-being of 10 or more points. Okay, and this is a large enough change to move someone from the medium-low scoring range to the high scoring range on the CFPB scoring mechanism. And we're going to draw data from the Understanding America study, which is a nationally representative longitudinal internet panel of American adults aged 18 and above, housed at USC. So one of the big benefits of the UAS panel, in addition to it being nationally representative, is that it contains really voluminous information on participants. So we have indicators of like cognitive ability, financial literacy, a load of demographic, financial behaviors, and health characteristics. And you can merge these characteristics across surveys and really know a lot about what's happening in people's lives right now and what happened in the past. So upon panel entry, all UAS participants are invited to complete a survey that contains the 10-item CFPB financial well-being scale. And then we're going to use another module that was fielded in September 2019 that re-asked the financial well-being scale. It's going to give us a median distance of about 3.1 years between elicitations for our analysis sample. And we have about 4,000 respondents in our primary analysis. So what do we find? So this chart is looking at distribution of changes in financial well-being between over our roughly 3.5 to 4 year window of observation. So you'll notice that in the aggregate, financial well-being is relatively stable. The modal change is about 0, and many people have small single-digit changes in financial well-being. But there's still a sizable fraction of the sample, about 30%, that experiences either a 10-point or more increase or a 10-point or more decrease. This distribution looks pretty similar if we divide it by category. So it looks relatively similar for women and men, older and younger respondents, higher educated and lower educated, higher income and lower income. Though the distributions for what we might consider as more economically vulnerable consumers, younger adults, Those with lower education and lower incomes are shifted to the left. Okay, it's indicating that these more economically vulnerable consumers are more likely to experience a large decrease and are less likely to experience a large increase. But we want to hone in on this 30% of the population that appears to have meaningful changes in financial well-being and examine what characteristics and factors are associated with these changes. So this chart is plotting regression coefficients and 95% confidence intervals from regressions examining what demographic characteristics are associated with large changes in financial well-being. So in the green, we're tracking increases in financial well-being, and in the orange, we're tracking decreases in financial well-being. So you'll see that older adults and those with higher incomes, other research has shown they have higher financial well-being in the present, and this also suggests that they're more likely to experience large increases in financial well-being in the future. We also find some evidence that Black individuals are more likely than white individuals to experience large increases in financial well-being, although I don't want to make too much of this because our point estimate here is really pretty noisy, and whites tend to have higher financial well-being at the outset, although we do control for that in our regression specifications. But more draw your attention to what appears to be protective against large decreases in financial well-being. Particularly, you see a couple modifiable characteristics, namely education level, those who have at least a college education or more, and financial literacy, those with higher levels of financial literacy, are less likely to experience large decreases in financial well-being. We dig a bit more into why this might be in the paper. We find that these factors appear to be protective against negative financial shocks, such that conditional on a shock occurring, people with higher financial literacy and higher levels of education are less likely to experience large decreases in financial well-being after the shock occurs. So it appears to be some protective value in education literacy. So although education and literacy are modifiable, it can be difficult to change these characteristics in the short run. So we also want to take a look at what financial behaviors might put one on the path to increasing financial well-being. To do that, we're going to zoom in a little bit. We don't have a host of behavioral characteristics or financial characteristics at the outset of when people join the UAS panel. So we're looking at a slightly shorter time horizon between May 2018 and May 2019, drawing data from the US Financial Health Pulse study led by the Financial Health Network in collaboration with USC, where we have measures of both financial well-being and financial behaviors in March 2018 and March 2019. And we're looking at how behaviors observed in May 2018 predict changes over the next year. We find that of our behaviors of interest, planning ahead financially, maintaining a manageable debt load as assessed by the respondent, and routinely saving in liquid accounts and spending less than one's income are all positively associated with large increases in financial well-being. Similarly, all four of these behaviors, including saving for retirement routinely, also appear to be protective against large decreases in financial well-being. So as I mentioned before, of course, in many ways, the world has changed quite a bit, inducing a lot more Zoom webinars rather than in-person events. And so we wanted to take a look and see whether or not the policy or the associations we observed pre-pandemic seem to hold post-pandemic. And so for that, we're going to use another wave from the US Financial Health Pulse study that looks at these characteristics and behaviors in May 2020, so shortly after the onset of the pandemic. I'll skip through the demographic characteristics in the interest of time, although note that we see pretty similar patterns pre and post-pandemic between the associations between demographic characteristics and increases and decreases in financial well-being. And spend a little bit more time focusing on what we see in terms of the association between financial behaviors and increases and decreases in financial well-being. And the short story is we see very, very similar patterns. Okay? Much like pre-pandemic, planning ahead financially, maintaining a manageable debt load, routinely saving in liquid accounts are all positively associated and statistically significant predictors of large increases in financial well-being. We see a directionally positive estimate on spending less than income, although our estimate here is not significant. But all the 5 behaviors, similar to what we observed pre-pandemic, all appear to be protective against large decrease in financial well-being. So this table I think just helps to crystallize the patterns we see pre-pandemic between May 2018 and May 2019 are very, very similar to those we see post-pandemic, where our last measurement occurred after the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. And that all the relationships are at least directionally the same, only difference being that spending less than income is no longer significant in the post-pandemic period, although I don't think we should make a whole big deal about lack of stars on that estimate. And all of the protective factors seem to be the same and are all highly significant in both pre and post periods. So I will wrap up here and say that we take a look at how financial being changes over a 3 to 4 year period. We find that despite some relative stability in the aggregate, there's a sizable portion of people that experience large changes of 10 or more points in financial well-being, and that several financial behaviors are predictive of future financial increases in future financial well-being, and namely planning ahead financially and maintaining a manageable debt load, routinely saving liquid accounts, and spending less than income are both associated with higher financial well-being today and seem to help put one on a path to improved financial health in the future. We also find that some modifiable characteristics are associated with lower likelihood of decreases in financial well-being, namely higher levels of education and higher levels of financial literacy. And they do so in part by mitigating against the adverse effects of negative financial shocks. We find very similar relationships both between characteristics and behaviors and financial well-being pre and post-pandemic. One important caveat that I want to make sure everyone understands that this analysis is descriptive. We cannot get all the way to causality in the linkage between the financial behaviors, characteristics, and changes in financial well-being. But I think it does suggest that in many ways, investing in one's financial health today, we know that all of the behaviors listed on the screen here are associated with higher financial well-being contemporaneously, suggest that it also will lead to improved financial well-being in the future. So there may not be this tension between focusing on one's financial health today, may not necessarily come at the expense of improved financial well-being in the future. So I will stop there and turn it over to Stephen Roll, who is a research assistant professor at SPI at WashU. And Stephen, take it away when you're ready.
Great, thanks, Jeremy. And thanks to everyone else for coming out today. So I'm just going to share my screen here. Okay, wonderful. So as Jeremy said, I'm an assistant professor of research at the Social Policy Institute in WashU. And what I will be presenting on today is some high-level findings from a couple papers we've recently written that both look at issues related to volatility in financial well-being and resilience against that volatility in financial well-being among low-income households in particular. And so the basic motivating questions for this study, or for these studies rather, is to what extent is financial well-being stable or volatile in an economically vulnerable population? What is the relationship between different negative financial events like income shocks, unemployment, and so on, expense shocks like unexpected car repairs, and medical shocks? So what is the relationship between these different medical shocks and changes in financial well-being? And then finally, how do different types of liquidity, savings, social resources, income flows, actually buffer households against the impacts of these negative financial events? So like I said, we're presenting findings from 2 papers. I just have this slide in here to just acknowledge my wonderful co-authors on these papers, Olga Kondracheva, Sam Buffy, McCall Grinstein-Weiss, and Stephanie Skis. But the first paper is primarily descriptive, looking at how changes in financial well-being relate to household characteristics and experiences. And then the second paper actually drills down and tries to isolate the actual impact of different financial shocks on financial well-being and how liquidity plays into that relationship. So both studies use data from the 2018 Refund to Savings Initiative. And this is a partnership we have with Intuit. And as the part of the Refund to Savings Initiative is to pair administrative tax data with longitudinal survey data. So the way this works is that tax filers who qualify for TurboTax Freedom Edition, which is the free version of TurboTax for low and moderate income households. So they go in, they fill out their taxes, we collect some administrative tax data there, and then after they're done with their taxes, they're invited to take wave 1 of a household financial survey that collects many additional details in their lives, their circumstances, their financial well-being. And then 6 months later, we follow up with these households again and ask them a similar array of questions in order to better understand how their lives have changed in the months after tax filing. So Jeremy already gave an excellent rundown of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's financial well-being scale. That is the outcome of interest in our studies. So in particular, we're looking at the change in financial well-being over this 6-month period, sort of a short-term period. And so just to get right into it, into the top line findings, is actually very similar findings in terms of the stability of financial well-being in our low-income sample to what we just saw Jeremy present. You always like to see that as a researcher. Similar array of results for a similar research question, right? We're focused on a low-income sample here, but what we find is similar to Jeremy's, which is that financial well-being is incredibly stable over a 6-month period. Of course, you see many people with large changes, either positive or negative, in the sample, but by and large, this is completely flat. At wave 1, the average financial well-being was 49.04 points. At wave 2, it was 48.96 points. It's basically 0, right? And we also see that in our low-income sample, financial well-being was stable across many, many different household characteristics, gender, race, ethnicity, and so on. Then, finding 2, we see that income shocks, or I guess I'll frame this more broadly, the type of shock matters, right? And that income shocks tend to be much more harmful to an individual's financial well-being than expense shocks, which in turn tend to be more harmful than medical shocks. So we start here with looking at the impact of income shock. So this includes things like unexpected job loss or an unexpected significant income decline. And here you can see that this income decline is associated with about a 5.2 point decline in financial well-being. Compare that to expense shocks in the next column. This includes things like unexpected car repairs, unexpected appliance repairs, things like that, these large significant expenses that are a necessary reality for many households. Here we see again statistically significant, but we see the magnitude is much lower. It's a negative 1.7 point decrease in financial well-being. And then finally, we look at medical shocks. And here we see it's associated with a 1 point decrease in financial well-being, but this is statistically insignificant. So then we get into our final set of findings in which we then say, okay, well, we know that expense shocks and income shocks are significantly associated with declines in financial well-being within the context of our analysis. Now let's look at how this relationship is governed by different types of liquidity sources that households can have. So first we start with just something very basic, right? Just looking at the income flows into households within our low income sample. And so here we define high income flows as households making more than $20,000 a year. That's those in the blue columns. That doesn't sound like high income, but again, keep in mind, this is a very low income sample. The average gross income in our sample is $16,000. So this high income within the low income context. And then we also look at households who make below $20,000 a year. Those are the columns in red. And what we can see is that for expense shocks, households with low income flows tend to be much more vulnerable to expense shocks than those with higher incomes. So lower income households tend to have a 2.6 point decline in the event of an expense shock compared to a statistically insignificant 0.7 point decrease in financial well-being for higher income households. For income shocks, the story is a little different. So actually higher income households are more vulnerable to income shocks than lower income households. This, to a degree, is somewhat intuitive, right? If you have more income and you face job loss, you are going to necessarily have a greater decrease in your overall incomes than those who have, say, lower incomes or more financially insecure, though the decrease in both cases is still statistically significant. The next type of liquidity we investigate is liquid savings, right? It's your classic form of liquidity. This is the basis of, emergency savings and your traditionally recommended type of financial buffer against financial volatility, right? So here we break our sample out by those above the median of liquid savings, around $2,700, and those below the median in liquid savings. And here we can see, again, similar story to income when we look at expense shocks, which is that households with low liquid savings are more vulnerable to expense shocks. So they experience a 2.4-point decline in financial well-being if they experience an expense shock, compared to a statistically insignificant 1-point decline for households with higher liquid savings. Turning to income shocks, now we see that those households with low liquid savings, they have about a 6.7-point decline in financial well-being, whereas households with high liquid savings, they still experience a significant decline in financial well-being, but this relationship is at least partially buffered by the presence of high liquid savings in these households. And then finally, we look at what we frame as social resources. So this is the ability to rely on friends or family in the event of an emergency to help you cover your expenses. And so in red, those are households who cannot access these social resources. In blue, these are households that can. And so we see here that households who cannot access social resources actually have a fairly large decline in their financial well-being in the event of an expense shock, whereas households who can access social resources, basically no decline whatsoever in their financial well-being. Income shocks is similar to what we saw for savings, which is that those who could not access social resources had about a 6-point decline in financial well-being, whereas those that could had about a 3.7-point decline in financial well-being. So just to summarize, again, we see that different types of shocks have different impacts on financial well-being. It's fairly logical ordering to these things. Income shocks are most harmful, followed by expense shocks, followed by medical shocks. We also see that different types of liquidity appear to be better suited towards mitigating different types of shocks. So income, savings, and social resources almost fully attenuated the impacts of expense shocks, but savings and social resources only partially attenuated the impact of income shocks. We didn't show this in the presentation in the interest of time. We also looked at access to credit, and it was not really a significant predictor of mitigating the impact of these shocks. And in thinking about the implications of these findings for the overall question that we're all asking today about the relationship between short-term savings and long-term financial well-being, one way of potentially thinking about this is that by mitigating the negative impact of financial shocks in the short term, liquidity access may actually help people recover more quickly from events like job loss and promote higher well-being in the long term. So I've presented here a pretty well-known set of findings from Diener et al., looking at the general well-being impacts of different life events. It's not financial well-being, it's general well-being, but they are analogous. So you can see in blue, that's marriage. So you can see there's a slight increase in marriage or at the point of marriage in terms of well-being, but then this returns to baseline pretty quickly. And then in red, that's the death of a spouse. And there you can see a very, very steep decline in satisfaction that recovers slowly, but never really returns to baseline. Then in green, you see the impact of unemployment, which in many respects is almost as harmful to a person's sense of well-being as the death of a spouse, which is quite incredible to me. But the logic may be, or the mechanism may be, that by promoting short-term savings, short-term liquidity access, we can actually buffer households against some of that decline in well-being in the event of job loss and help speed their recovery over time. Of course, as we've noted today, there's much more research needed on this front over longer time periods. But it's not that simple, right? So building savings and increasing income, extremely difficult for low-income households well, all households, but low-income households in particular. But promising opportunities to do this could involve like helping these households who experience job loss or income loss, like access aspects of the gig economy, giving them access to smartphones that can actually like run these apps, or even access to vehicles or capital investments that can help them drive for Uber or participate in TaskRabbit to help them cover some of these income shortfalls that are an unfortunate reality for many low-income households. Another option is, of course, your classic expanding and maintaining social welfare programs that target the economically vulnerable, such as the recent and encouraging child tax credit and earned income tax credit expansions. And also, of course, identifying key opportunities to help households save, such as the tax refund, working with employers to develop programs that automatically deduct from people's payrolls into emergency savings accounts, similar to what we do now with retirement accounts. But those are ways of buffering households, the actions that households in many ways can take to buffer themselves against the harm of income shocks and expense shocks. But employers and policymakers could play an additional role in mitigating the risks of these shocks as well. For example, right now, laws generally do not require employers to give substantial advance notice of termination of employees. And they also allow employers to engage in irregular and unpredictable scheduling practices. These things may make the actual realized like human cost of income shocks, income declines, much more difficult to plan for and therefore more harmful to individuals. They also, we know from research, make it more difficult for households to actually plan their finances and build savings, which, as we've demonstrated, is a key tool that households have to actually mitigate the impact of financial shocks. So thank you. If you have any questions, you can, of course, reach me by email. But with that, I will turn it over to my friend and colleague, Emily Gallagher.
Get right into it. Thanks to ARP and the Social Policy Institute for inviting me. So before we can evaluate whether an emergency savings buffer matters for short-term or longer-term financial well-being, we need to define what is a substantial emergency savings buffer. Is $10 enough, or do you need to have many thousands of dollars? If you get financial advisors, different ideas about what is a good buffer, and their recommendations are usually orders of magnitude more than most low-income households manage to save. So for example, if you look at Orman, she recommends that households have at least 8 months of living expenses based on the duration of a long unemployment spell. Investopedia.com pushes households to have a bit over $14,000 because that's about a quarter of the average annual expenditure per household. Yet we're sort of making a mockery of this advice right now because, as you know, a Fed study a couple of years ago showed that almost half of US households could not easily handle an emergency expense of just $400 without having to take out a loan. So here is to offer an empirically grounded estimate of how much a low-income household really needs to save at a minimum. And so to do that, we're going to use the survey of income and program participation, and we're going to plot the fraction of households that enter into some type of financial hardship over the next few months. So they're skipping rent, they're not making a utility payment, they can't afford food, they can't afford their prescriptions. And we plot the probability of experiencing any one of those hardships over the next few months at different levels of initial liquid savings today. And we're going to do this separately for low, middle, and high income households. And for low income households, there's kind of a striking relationship here because the correlation between savings and near-term hardship is negative and large in magnitude at these low levels of initial savings. And it's almost flat at higher levels of savings. So say you have about $3,000 in initial liquid assets, an additional dollar doesn't seem to be very correlated with falling into hardship. But if you have much less, say you have $200, then an additional dollar does seem to matter quite a bit. Now for the middle and the low and the high income groups, this same relationship is both more linear and comparatively flatter. So what's going on here? What creates this convex shape in the savings hardship relationship for low-income households? Theoretically, that you're going to get this shape whenever two things are present. The first thing is that the expense shock distribution, which I've plotted here, so this is the unexpected expenses, is also convex. And what I mean by that is when you plot the frequency of unexpected expenses of different costs, you see that the vast expenses are small dollar and really big expenses are actually quite rare. So if you have a barrage of these small dollar shocks is going to be enough to push you into hardship. And when you have a big savings buffer, you can absorb nearly all of the shocks that are coming your way. The second factor is that low-income people have difficulty adjusting their budget or using credit or buying insurance to help them absorb some of these expense shocks. You can't easily switch to a cheaper cell phone plan if you're already on the cheapest cell phone plan that you can find, right? So if you don't buffer, an expense shock is going to translate pretty directly into a financial hardship versus a higher income person may be able to put that shock on credit. They might be able to collect an insurance payout or just reduce their cost of living. And that ability to adjust is going to lead to a much flatter savings hardship relationship that we saw here. So the reason this convexity for low-income folks is so important is that it implies that there are points in this savings distribution where an additional dollar of savings has sharply diminished returns in terms of any associated decline in the probability of financial hardship. So we use some fancy threshold regression techniques that I won't get into here to arrive at the savings amount that is associated with the sharpest kink in this trend line that relates savings to near-term financial hardship. And we find the sharpest kink, the sharpest break in this trend line is occurring at about $2,452 in an inflation-adjusted 2019 dollars. And that's about 1 month of income for the median low-income household. So 1 month of income is probably a lot less than most financial advice that we give to people about having a savings buffer. So what we say here is that any amount above this kink, this threshold, we'll call that a substantial emergency savings buffer. A couple caveats here. We calculate this relationship using people that were sampled about 10 years ago. We inflation adjust it, but this threshold can be expected to change over time as prices update, as the frequency of different types of shocks change. Also, different households are going to have different threshold points. So we might expect this threshold to be larger, and in fact, we do find it is, for single mothers or people without health insurance. For them, we're talking about more like $3,500. So just bear that in mind when I'm going through this. But basically what this relationship says is that at least in the near term, if you have a savings buffer of at least this $2,400, your probability of entering hardship in the near term is pretty low. But what about over the longer term? Does it also translate into less financial hardship, say 2-3 years down the road? And so that's what we're going to test using the 2014 SIP. So the 2014 SIP is kind of like an out of sample test. We built this threshold using an earlier version of this panel study, and now we're going to use a later version. And we're going to look at people from 2013 to 2016, and we're going to look at whether low-income households that have at least this $2,400 mark incur less financial distress 3 years later. So we'll follow them for 4 years, see how much they have saved as of 2013, and see what state of financial hardship they're in 3 years later, wave 4 of the survey. To do this, we need to be able to compare a person's degree of hardship relative to her peers over time. And so that means we need to be able to place a bunch of people along a continuum of hardship in each wave. In order to do that, we're going to weight a bunch of different indicators of hardship we're basically going to apply an optimal weight that sort of best captures their central commonality. If you know anything about statistics, this is called a principal components analysis. And we do this, we apply these weights in order to build an index of hardship. And then once we have everybody along this continuum, we're going to divide them up into terciles. And so we'll have a low hardship, a middle hardship, and a high hardship group for each wave. So high hardship in wave 4 equals 1 means that the household is in the highest tercile of hardship of the hardship index as of wave 4, so the final wave of the survey that we're going to run. So the regression test for correlation between having a savings buffer of at least this amount today and whether or not the household is in the highest tercile of hardship 3 years later as of wave 4 of the survey. And we're going to import relevant factors. So what state of hardship were they in today? We're going to control for all the aspects of the person's balance sheet, including how much they had in liquid assets today. And we're going to control for changes in their income, their total debt, as well as for things like changes in their access to social programs. For example, did Medicaid get expanded in their state? And what we find is that when a household has a buffer of above this amount, as of wave 1, that household's probability of being in the high hardship tercile 3 years later, as of wave 4, falls by 9.5 percentage points. So if you have a substantial savings buffer today, 3 years later, your probability of being in the worst tercile in terms of that hardship index falls by about 9.5 percentage points. So that's great. Take households in high hardship in wave 1, and we look at what state they're in 3 years later in wave 4. We're asking, are they able to drop down to the mid hardship tercile, or even better, to the low hardship tercile by wave 4? And what we find is those who manage to build up at least that savings threshold at some point before wave 4. We find about 32% of these guys will successfully transition down to the low hardship state. So they started out in the high hardship state, but at some point they managed to build up a savings buffer. And so by wave 4, 3 years later, they're found to actually be in the low hardship state, 32% of them. Now, this compares with just 18% of the households that never managed to get to that buffer amount over the preceding 2 years. So meanwhile, started in that high hardship tier, but never seemed to reach the savings threshold. The majority of 57% saw no improvement in their financial state 3 years later. Okay, so what do we take away here? We find that achieving a substantial emergency savings buffer, even if you have to draw it down at certain periods to handle an expense, just managing to achieve that buffer is correlated with better financial well-being, not just a few months into the future, but also over the longer term, at least 3 years down the road. Now, one thing I want to caveat here is that correlation is not causation, right? It's possible that improvements in financial well-being are due to, for example, getting a more stable job, and that job might permit a household to both save more and experience less hardship over time. So it's not necessarily the case that the savings is what's causing the hardship to go down. It could be that job. Still, it's important to bear in mind that household chooses to save, right? The household could instead choose to consume any extra discretionary income they have. So what we're basically showing here is that choice to hold a savings buffer, a substantial, is correlated with lower hardship, both in the near term as well as 3 years into the future. Another caveat here is that our data is all sort of from a different era, right? This is pre-pandemic. It's from the 2010s. And the tools that households have used historically to manage shocks may be forever changed. So we may be talking about this in the panel discussion later, but the pandemic certainly affected the ability of households to smooth their income by using gig work, right? A lot of programs like Uber kind of shut down for a period of time, but the pandemic also led to a lot of UBI, universal basic income like programs like the child tax credit, which could also be used to absorb expense shocks into the future. So all of that to bear in mind, but still we find pretty convincing evidence, at least we think, that having an emergency savings buffer of at least that $2,400 mark is correlated with better financial well-being up to 3 years into the future. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily, and all of our panelists. I'd like to invite you back for the discussion portion of today's event, which will be moderated by Hector Ortiz, who's a senior policy analyst at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. I want us to dig right in. If you have additional questions, please submit those through the Q&A function, and we will funnel those right to Hector.
Well, thank you, Catherine, and thank you, AARP and the Social Policy Institute for the invitation. An important part of my work at the CFPB is researching financial well-being and what drives financial well-being. And I recall conducting interviews with consumers of all ages, up to age 95, on what financial well-being meant to them and what was important to achieve financial well-being. And the concept of savings came across in all of those interviews. And an important factor that was important to all of the dimensions that Jeremy spoke about, having control over day-to-day expenses, being able to absorb a financial shock. If you think about your typical financial goals of people, buying a home, buying a car, planning for college, all of those are around savings. And then ultimately this idea of enjoying life, whether for many people it was just giving a gift, going to a restaurant, and all of those people said, I will rather pay with savings. So all of these are very intuitive findings, they're conventional wisdom. So I would like to actually start a conversation with the panelists today with, are there findings from your work that actually challenge the conventional wisdom about the role of savings and their influence on long-term financial security?
I could perhaps start. So one thing I think our research pushes back against a bit is the notion that if you're investing in your short-term financial health or focusing on the near term, that this is necessarily going to come at the expense of long-term financial well-being. So we saw a lot of the behaviors that we know are associated with short-term financial well-being, like spending less than income, just saving in liquid accounts, which hints at Emily's paper as well, that this helps improve financial well-being in the near term and also may help put one on the path to future financial well-being. So there doesn't have to be a disconnect between the two. And oftentimes, I think it's often more important goal for people that don't have a lot of assets to build up a emergency savings fund before they start trying to save for retirement. That may be ultimately the best way to lead to future financial well-being rather than trying to focus on the future at the expense of the present.
And I'll go next. So outside of the context of what I just presented on today, a lot of our work at the Social Policy Institute focuses on identifying like key opportunities to help low-income households in particular, build savings, be they the tax refund or other windfalls. And one thing we have observed in that it challenges the conventional wisdom that low-income households either don't or can't save for either the short or long-term purposes. Basically, what we see is that these households are just really hungry for any opportunity where they can have any sort of financial slack to accomplish both their short and long-term goals. So in the context of the tax refund, for example, the most common usage of the tax refund among low-income households is, of course, to pay down debts, but followed pretty closely by then building up short-term savings. But that in itself is also followed then closely by building long-term savings for things like education or a down payment on a house or some other major purchase as well as retirement. But this basically says to me that, it is not that low income households don't think about savings for the short or the long term. It's just that, the way we've, structured pay and wages and social support in this country, they just don't have that many opportunities to pursue their financial goals. And when they get them, they're actually pretty savvy in allocating those funds towards many both short and long-term financial goals.
One thing, when I showed that graph earlier, showing that the relationship between hardship and savings is actually nonlinear, one of the implications of that is that there are probably poverty traps, and they're really hard to escape from, which is why having a savings buffer is so important for long-term well-being, is because if you get stuck in one of these traps, you can be there for a really long time. So I kind of think of us all as like little magnets floating in the air, and there are these two big magnets, and sort of poverty trap. And the other is this much better sort of equilibrium where you can save and you don't enter into hardship very often. And the problem with the poverty trap one is you don't have a lot saved. And so an expense shock pushes you to, say, miss a rent payment. And you maybe take out a payday loan, or you get an eviction record, and it becomes much, much harder than to ever save. You sort of get stuck. And so emergency savings sort of helps you be drawn to that better magnet where you can handle most of the shocks that are coming your way. And it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy where, because you saved, you got away from that poverty trap magnet, and you're heading towards this other one, and you're able to weather the storms that come, and then save up again for the next storm. So just to say that relationship that we see actually, I think, has deeper theoretical implications on why short-term emergency savings actually affects us over the long term.
Well, thank you, and we have many questions in our chat that I know some of you specifically will be able to answer it. And Steve, you have one question. You mentioned that the access to credit wasn't significant in as part of your research, and one of the questions is, can you speculate why you think that's the case?
Yeah, and so the first thing I'll note about that is, I am fully in support of providing access to affordable credit for everybody in order to manage income shortfalls or expense shocks, right? But why do we see that there's less of a relationship between, say, credit access, which is a core component of liquidity, and financial well-being in the event of these shocks? I suspect the first and most likely answer is simply that if you put something on credit, the expense is still there. You might have just drawn the expense out over time, but it is still there. And if you're a low income household, you're often getting worse terms on your credit than a higher income household. So not only is the expense there, but it's compounding at higher rates. But the other thing to note is simply that we're talking about well-being here, and debt has a pretty unique relationship to well-being relative to other financial indicators. I mean, there's plenty of research out there on sort of what I think of as the human costs of debt. So higher rates of longer-term illness, stress, depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, as well as an inability to think or plan for the future nearly to the same extent. And so you think all these things are very correlated with what I would consider to be general well-being and financial well-being as well. So even though you've been able to handle, say, the short-term expense on your credit, it is not only still going to be there, but it's also probably going to weigh on you over a longer period of time than if you handled it through savings, or if you handled it through, say, getting support from your friends or family.
Yeah, and I'll say that theme came in our interviews with consumers, that generally this peace of mind of not having debt, it's something that weighs on how they assess their financial well-being. Jeremy, there's a question that I think pertains particularly to your work, and we talked a lot about big sort of shocks that people experience, including loss of employment and also medical shocks. the pandemic certainly was all about that. It was a health emergency. It was also an economic emergency in loss of income, but also the government responded pretty robustly, expanding access to healthcare, expanding not just with unemployment insurance, but enhancing the unemployment insurance. So there are questions in the chat about do you have any information around the effects of that government response? And I know that you noted that you started to explore the relationship with the stimulus payments.
Yeah, and first I want to say that in a broader sample across more of the income distribution, we find pretty similar results to what Stephen found in the lower income sample, that far and away income shocks, particularly job loss, is most highly associated with decreases in financial well-being. For us, followed by medical expenses, so sort of merging his two categories together into one. But one interesting thing we saw, so we got some nice variation in our sample from March 2020, that about half of our sample had received their stimulus check at the time they completed the survey. So stimulus receipt timing is not entirely random, but we use this variation to sort of look at how stimulus receipt is associated with mitigating negative financial shocks. And what we find is that receiving the stimulus, as you might expect, is associated with improvements in financial well-being, and particularly less likely to have reduced financial well-being following the onset of the pandemic. But this effect is concentrated almost entirely on individuals that had an income shock. So really, the stimulus didn't have a big impact on financial well-being for those who were able to maintain their jobs and work as they normally would have, but it had a very large effect for those that had income reductions. Didn't entirely mitigate it. There was still reductions in financial well-being, but the size was considerably less for those who received the stimulus relative to those who didn't receive the stimulus. So some evidence that this robust government policy response had at least some of the intended effects of offsetting some of the labor market shocks that many of us experienced early in the onset of the pandemic.
And that's aligned with just our own sort of research with the panel, a credit panel that we have, that we were able to survey in 2019 and 2020. And we observed that a pretty sort of consistent, stable financial well-being generally, but 40% reporting a decline in financial well-being between those two periods. But those who receive, for instance, a forbearance on their mortgage, that didn't mean that they will have positive financial well-being, but it meant mitigated the negative effects of the again, the loss of a job on the ability to pay the mortgage and the financial well-being. I have a question for Emily that it's probably one of the biggest challenges of anyone who works in financial education and in this space, and that is there anything in your research that says anything about the characteristics of those who are more successful at rebuilding and building that threshold of about $2,400 in savings?
Yes, we don't look at the characteristics of people who manage to build it up or don't manage to build it up. I will say that, sort of in reference to your question earlier about like the conventional wisdom here, I think one important thing to point out is that these savings buffers are meant to be used. So they're meant to be drawn down and built back up as emergency expenses or income shocks occur. And so you might see like a snapshot of somebody at a moment in time, and it might look like they don't seem to save much. But actually, if you look over a longer term, they do tend to build back a buffer. So that's something we try to be careful about in our analysis, to look at people at different snapshots in time, because some people will draw it down and then they'll build it back up.
And sadly, we are at time. There's a couple of other questions that we will hope we can answer directly with the participants. And now back to Catherine. And again, thank you for the opportunity to moderate.
Wonderful. Thank you, Hector. I do wish we had more time today. If you would like to see more events like this, feel free to give us a shout in the Q&A here or to email the Social Policy Institute. Just want to thank all of our speakers again for highlighting some of these really key themes around savings as a high watermark and a precautionary buffer, but certainly not the be all end all, and to show just how dynamic financial lives are and how modifiable really financial well-being is. That should give us a lot of hope as policy makers and product and program designers. And I hope that it's been beneficial to all of our viewers today. We will be posting a recording of this session for you to share with your colleagues. I know lots of folks are out on vacation over the next few weeks. So we'll be promoting that back in the fall for people to revisit this event, and feel free to reach out to AARP or the Social Policy Institute to get in touch with any of the panelists you heard today. With that, I'd like to bid you a good afternoon. Bye-bye.